All right, I got a question that was posted to me or sent to me a while back, and I never got around to recording this. This is a great question. So here we go. I've been a developer for greater than 20 years, and I want to go into freelance. The problem is that my design skills are very raw. Therefore, I believe I would greatly benefit from partnering with a good designer. I have some questions, though. Number one, what percentage of pay is typically fair for both parties, and how does one decide? To me, development seems more difficult and time-consuming than design, so I could see a larger split going to the developer. However, I could be wrong about the time and difficulty, plus it's crucial to have good design. I just want to be fair to both parties. All right, so you have a good attitude. Being fair to both parties is the medium and long-term good strategy, because you want to create good relationships with whomever you happen to deal with, client or partners, collaborators, etc. Difficulty in the work. It depends. Your typical design is easier, shall we say, than your typical programming, but great designers who have a good understanding of UX and UI are very rare indeed. And I would argue that's more important in terms of an app success than the back end these days. So how do you determine who gets paid? So let's say you're doing freelance work and you're going to partner with a designer. You ask the designer, first of all, you check out to see if you get along with them. You check out their portfolio, make sure they got good track record in terms of their skills. And if everything checks out, then you say, well, how much do you want? And you get the amount. And then when you do secure a client, you have to judge and factor in how much time you figure it's going to take in terms of design to implement. And then you just charge accordingly, right? So if you are a freelancer and you're dealing with somebody, you're probably going to build a client, and then your partner designer, if they're not partners in the company, but say you collab with them on projects, then he or she will bill you, and then everybody gets paid. Now you're going to have to learn how to judge project time and so on. I teach all that in my freelance course, by the way. Shameless plug. But yeah, that's one way of looking at it. If you do partner full-time with a designer, then you're just going to have to negotiate that. Depends what level of designer they are versus what level of developer you are. And you're going to have to determine whether or not their skills is at your level, in equivalency. Meaning, are they the same level of designer as you are a coder? How common is that level of designer versus how common is your level of coder is? I hope that makes sense. So there you go. In the end, what a person's time is worth is a negotiated position. So you're just going to have to feel that one out. Question number 2. Is it common for one party to find work and then negotiate the dollar value for farming out the work? For example, if the designer finds a client, would he or she even offer a dev a certain amount without disclosing how much he or she is getting from the client? It could be. Sometimes that's the case. When I was a freelancer and I would partner with people, it happened on occasion. Sometimes it would be that way where I would say, okay, how much do you want to build this? And they would give me a dollar amount. And if it made sense in my budget, I'd say, cool. Other times, it was a much more involved project. We would look at the budget overall, and then we would talk about how much time each of us will be spending on it, and we would determine, what the value of that time was. Another factor to consider, if somebody comes with the client, that has a certain amount of value up front. So like salesmen will get a certain percentage of the sale. So if you bring in the client and you're managing the client, you're going to get more, of course, than the designer. Or if you're the designer who brings in the client and is managing the project and the client and dealing with the client, then that person who's interfacing with the client, who is the bridge to the client, they deserve more, of course, because there's more work involved there, right? Number 3, what are the typical roles of both parties? I read an article that said that the designer usually works more closely with the client than the developer, which makes sense. Again, it depends on the type of project. If the project is more visually oriented, yeah, then you're going to see the designer talking much more often with the client. Of course, if you were managing the project and then you could basically be that interface between the client and the designer. Sometimes designers would prefer not to deal with the client because that could be a headache and they'd rather just deal with you. So you could manage the project. And so let's say you go see the client. You say, what kind of design do you want? What are the design characteristics, etc. You go back, you talk to the designer, you say, what can we do? Boom, boom, boom. Let's create 3 demos, if you will. Bring it back to the client. So you're shielding your designer from the process of having to deal with the client. So again, you would deserve more in that situation. Nothing is set in stone. A lot of these things are negotiated because skill sets and level of experience and the nature of the project will affect all this. I go into a lot of detail in my freelance course when I talk about managing clients and project expectations and so forth. So there you go. Number 4, what else should I know about partnerships? First thing I tell people, partnerships are like marriage. So you better pick wisely before you become full partners. What's a better thing to do, especially at first when you don't know somebody so well, especially in terms of you don't know working wise. So you may have a friend that you know well, but you don't know them in terms of what it's like to deal with this guy or girl once you start working with them. When you get into working situations where there's deadlines and when there's money involved, personalities can change, right? So what I would suggest when you're first partnering with somebody, do it on a per contract basis. If it's your client, I would be the interface between you and the designer. Let's say you're dealing with a designer, or if you're a designer, UX person, be the interface between you and with the programmer. This way, you don't want to risk your reputation on a new potential collaborator or partner with your clients, right? Now, on the other hand, if you do decide you're going to start a web development business with a partner right from the get-go, again, I would do 1 or 2 small projects with them, where you split the revenue as separate entities, separate businesses, just to see how it goes, right? It's like dating somebody. You want to date them for at least a little while before you commit to anything serious. When you partner with somebody, it's essentially a marriage. So, I wouldn't marry somebody unless I was dating them for at least a couple years, a year and a half, 2 years. So you see what happens when they're under stress. You see what happens, in terms of how consistent they are, in terms of living up to their word, in terms of work and so forth. So, so tread very carefully, slowly, and lightly when going into partnerships with anybody. You can get burnt pretty bad. And if you start seeing early indicators that your potential partner is going to be problematic, you'll be super happy that you've only partnered with them on a per project basis where you're basically running separate businesses. Because when you start integrating the businesses into 2 partners own one business, then it becomes a very messy situation legally and financially and so on. That being said, if you do end up partnering with somebody and you see that it is a viable business, they pass that test, you both pass that test, right? Because if he's smart or she's smart, she's going to be testing you as well. Then what you do is you got to do 2 things. A, you got to create a partnership agreement with something called a shotgun clause, so that you pre-agree upon how one partner can extricate out of the business cleanly, because you don't want to go to court. That could be problematic, going to lawyers and court fighting over assets of a business after a couple years. Number 2, you don't want to go into a classic partnership. Now, depending on where you live in the world, you have different legal entities in terms of how you would partner with people. Now, in North America, you got this concept of the partnership, which is a very simple, legal, binding partnership, kind of like a marriage. And that could be very dangerous legally and financially to do it that way. A better way is to have a corporation. A corporation is a separate legal entity, at least in North America. You'd have to check about where you happen to live in the world. But the point of the corporation is to shield you from legal responsibilities, to shield you from financial problems. So having a corporation is a nice, clean way to partner with somebody long term. So I would never partner with anybody directly. I would always run through a corporation, because if you do it directly, you could be fully responsible, personally, financially responsible for whatever your partner does. Whereas if you have a corporation, only the corporation is responsible. So let's say you own a couple houses, or you own a house, or you got a bunch of money, you got a bunch of investments, and you set up a typical partnership outside of a corporation, and you find out your partner ends up running up $100,000 in debt because he's got a gambling habit you didn't realize, put it on the company credit card. If you have a partnership, then you would likely, at least in North America, be fully responsible for that $100,000 in debt on the credit card, on the company credit card. And so the credit card company could sue you for $100,000, and then you would say, well, it's that guy who ran up the debt. Doesn't matter, because you're a partnership. You are fully liable for the debt. So then you would have to sue your partner to get that money back, which would be very expensive. Whereas you have a corporation, and the corporate credit card runs up $100,000 in debt, which you should never let happen in the first place. But that's another story. Only the corporation is liable for that debt. But imagine if you had a partnership, a legal partnership, your partner runs up all that debt, and the banks come after you and say, hey, you owe us $100,000, and they go after your house, or they grab your investments, your personal investments. It's very dangerous. So never directly partner with somebody. If you want to partner, use a corporate structure, and better yet, do joint partnerships, meaning you hire him or her, or she or he hires you on a per project basis. This way you're not legally bound to each other. You have separate bank accounts, you have separate corporate entities, you do separate taxes, much cleaner. Anyway, I talk about this in my entrepreneur course and much more. I talk about this in my freelance course and much more. This is like the 5-minute version. Anyway, I hope that helps. There you go. Bye-bye.